Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets.
What are we talking about today?
We're talking about Fred Lee Crisman.
So I have to interject and apologize that we've done this once before, which today will be different, but I messed up that audio, so I'm eager to hear the new things that you're adding.
Well, the audio messed up itself, I suppose.
Go. I'll take it,
Yeah, Fred Lee Crisman is an interesting character in the sort of realm of American conspiratology, if there is such a thing, and now there is.
What, really?
Yeah, well, because I just invented the word. Or someone else did, I'm sure. Conspirosphere is another term. I think I may have invented that one.
I like that one.
But, and all words have, somebody had to come up with them the first time.
Yeah.
But in the general realm of modern American conspiracy theory, Fred Lee Crisman is a figure of, well, if you pay attention to those things, some note. In fact, he even has his own sort of, not sort of, he actually has an animated movie which is being made about him.
Who's making an animated movie?
I can't remember the name of the fellow who's doing it. I think you can find it on YouTube, which is the kind of the promo for it. It's something like Fred Crisman and Cave of the Space Nazis. There we go.
Maybe I watched it. I think, when is it?
It's been out for a while. It's been out
I watched
for a year
it.
or so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's sort of a promo for the animated film that's going to be made that I'm not sure has actually in and of itself been made. Okay. And I have to say that is, it's really interesting, and I'm glad he's doing that, but it just adds to the whole kind of completely corrupted mythology about Fred Lee Crisman.
Yeah.
It's for entertainment purposes only. And what we're going to try to do here today is to sort through the issues of fact and fiction about Crisman. And this is often difficult to do because I think the one basic fact about Fred Crisman is that he was always lying, except when he was telling the truth. It's a combination of those two things. And his whole career, the way that you'll run across him, if you go out and you're Googling Fred Lee Crisman, you'll go to the Wikipedia page, and that will explain some things, but only a portion of it. But the thing that you'll note if you look at that is that what Fred Lee Crisman is most notably connected to is the 1947 Maury Island UFO incident. And then the late 1960s, 1968, 1969, Jim Garrison JFK assassination investigation.
So it seemed too. So did he go seeking out these kind of, events as far as for popularity's sake? Or?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the interesting question. Because there are two different sides to this guy completely. On the one hand, it should be noted, there have been people who've argued that Fred Crisman never really existed, that he's somehow a composite. He's very real. There's a huge paper trail about him, which, as paper trails do, only explain part of the picture. But yes, he was very real, and you can trace his career. His life is not particularly long. I think he dies at 57. So he was born in 1919, dies in 1975. But there's a lot of stuff packed into that. And one of the basic questions, and this is interesting, not just from a sort of conspiratology point of view, but from an historical point of view, is that how much, it's an interesting case of how much can you really learn from the historical
Right.
record, the paper trail which is there, the basic facts about people? What do those really tell you? Do they tell, if you were to go out and you were to collect all of the information which is available in the public record, if you were to look at birth and death records, military records, the articles that appear in newspapers, criminal records, court records, and you were to put all of those together, would you have a complete picture of the person? And in Crisman's case, I'd have to say absolutely not. You would get a kind of framework, but I think that's probably true for most cases that you would look at, just about anyone. Because as I've probably point out way too often, is that what passes for an historical narrative is largely a matter of interpretation and opinion.
Yeah.
You have certain basic facts. And then you can take those and you try to create some sort of matrix, some sort of narrative matrix around them that gives different significance to this or that. This is important. This isn't important. What sort of things don't we know? What are the gaps in this? Mm-hmm. But it calls for a lot of speculation, a lot of surmise. And in the case of Crisman, we've got a person who certainly is engaging in his own self-mythologizing. He creates a lot of these stories about himself. Mm-hmm. We know that in some cases that he's creating these stories. He's making stuff up. That's the simple way to put it. In other cases, there are things written about him, said about him that he's not making up, although in some way he may be the inspiration for it. And then there's just things that people add willy-nilly as time goes on, like Cave of the Space Nazis. I'm not sure he was ever in a cave, and he certainly did not encounter space Nazis or any Nazis in that case. But it makes a good title in this case. Yeah. So you got a guy whose early part of his life, he's involved in one of the early and still often cited UFO cases. 1947 is the same year of Roswell, the same year in which Kenneth Arnold, the guy who basically coined the term flying saucer or flying disc, saw his 9 objects bobbing around Mount Rainier. And in fact, as we'll see, there's a very close connection between Arnold's sighting and the Maury Island case. Okay. One is an inspiration for the other. And then the Garrison case. Now, for the uninitiated in this case, Jim Garrison was a district attorney in New Orleans in the late 1960s. And he was one of the first to begin to actively investigate alternative conspiratorial theories to the JFK assassination. So Garrison rejected the Warren report, rejected the single bullet, single assassin theory around Lee Harvey Oswald, and he believed that there was a conspiracy, and that conspiracy was in some way centered in New Orleans, and he opened an investigation, and he began subpoenaing people to come in and testify. Now, the upshot of this is that he eventually filed charges against some people, the most important of which was a New Orleans businessman by the name of Clay Shaw, arguing that Clay Shaw was somehow at the center of this assassination cabal. Clay Shaw was acquitted. The case I'd say that Garrison in many ways was stretching the definition of circumstantial evidence in his case against Shaw and others. Although, curiously enough, it turns out that certain things he alleged about Shaw at the time and which were denied did subsequently turn out to be true, which doesn't prove that Garrison was correct.
Right.
But Garrison becomes convinced in the course of this investigation that not only was Fred Crisman involved in the larger plot around the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but was in fact a very important figure and a kind of undercover agent, government agent of long standing. Okay. Now that's one of the other things that tends to come out of this is that either Crisman or others spent a good deal of time and effort trying to paint a picture of him as a kind of danger man, as this sort of, as a domestic CIA operative who was involved in all kinds of shady things, which probably aren't true.
Oh.
But some of them might have been.
Okay.
So that's one of the things that we'll try to go through this. Now, there's still a lot of questions, but let's go back to the beginning. That's where you always have to start with.
Yeah.
So if you're going to go in any kind of, whether it's a biographical investigation, any kind of an historical investigation, go back to the beginning. So what do we know about the origins of Fred Lee Crisman? Well, his full name is Frederick Lee Crisman, but that's not the name he was born under. The name he was born under was nothing.
Nothing.
Was No Name Crisman. I mean, but actually not No Name Crisman, just no name.
How?
No name was entered when he was born.
So what, his mother just didn't...
Well, that was corrected. His birth certificate, he's born in 1919, in July 1919, and in 1956, his mother, who was still alive at the time, went in and petitioned to have the birth certificate corrected with his name on it.
Okay.
So technically, there's no birth certificate with his name on it until 1956. Now, that raises a kind of interesting question. What could be the possible reasons for that? Well, you begin to look through his father. So who's his father? His mother was originally named, she went by, her name was Ava. And her mother was married a couple of times, so sometimes she went by her stepfather's name. But let's just leave her as Crisman's mother. His father was also Fred Crisman, Fred Monroe Crisman.
Okay.
And Fred Monroe Crisman married Ava in 1919, and then I take it back, not 19, married her in 1918, and then he immediately went to the U.S. Army. So got married, he went to the Army, went overseas in August 1918.
Just for wrap-up stuff? Like from World War I?
Yeah, the war's still going on. And
yeah. When does it end? It's
November.
Yeah, okay.
November 19.
Right.
Armistice Day, Veterans
Yes.
Day.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, there we go.
Jesus.
So he got there for the tail end of the war, but the salient point here is that he leaves the Seattle, Tacoma area where they were living at around July of 1918. Fred, remember, is born in July 1919.
Okay. Oh.
So keep in mind,
Sure.
Fred Sr. and Mom Ava are apart for basically a year.
Interesting.
During that time,
Interesting.
Daddy returned, nominal daddy. So this is one of the things that and this begins to explain why on the birth certificate,
Okay.
the lack of a father identified and even the lack of the name of the child.
Yeah.
I think what that had to do with at the time was probably some issue with Fred M.,
Right.
who probably wasn't terribly happy about this.
Yeah.
I mean, he could count
Yeah.
as to whether or not the child was going to be acknowledged as his.
Right.
So the child's name was not there. Apparently it was, and then Crisman would always talk about this guy later on as his dad. But that's one of the things that right away introduces a kind of unusual circumstance in this.
Some instability.
And other than that, he grew up in eastern Oregon for the most part, in different places. The family lived around the Seattle-Tacoma area, and then they eventually end up around the Ontario Vale area. In fact, there were different members of the family that lived in Boise, Idaho. So they're sort of in that region. His father is an interesting character. His mom was described by a lot of people who knew her as a gal who really enjoyed a good time.
Oh, yeah.
Party girl sometimes comes out, which is an interesting term for the 20s, which explains a lot of things. And then, but Dad was, well, what do we know about Dad if we go to the public record? He served at least one stint for bootlegging in 31 to 32.
Oh, really?
And he also was, perhaps more seriously, sentenced in Washington. He got a 1 to 5 year sentence for forgery in 1932.
Huh.
Served about a year on that before he was paroled. And if you collect other bits and pieces of information, well, say you get different levels of information. One of them is that you've got the public record.
Sure.
You got a birth certificate that has no name for the child.
Yeah.
You have an issue with paternity. Who knows who Fred Lee Crisman's actual father was? I'm not sure that he really knew that. He sort of accepts he has a man who he accepts as his father. And then you have the anecdotal evidence. And this is the stuff that people say. Someone said this.
Mm-hmm.
It may be true, it may not be, but what you have to listen to in that is how often the same thing comes up. Do a lot of people say the same thing in different circumstances? And here again, you have to keep in mind are they just, is everybody just parroting? Did one person say this, another do it? Or does it appear that this was a more general idea? And so one of the things that we know is that Fred Crisman Sr. had a criminal record.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also involved in other economic activities that some might consider to be questionable. He really liked the ponies and racetracks.
Okay.
He ran racetrack concessions. At various times, he owned racehorses, and in other cases, he managed wrestlers.
Oh, right.
So, those are a little déclassé, I suppose.
Yeah.
But he was kind of on the fringes of respectability.
Married to a party girl.
Married to a party girl. They ran a hotel in Vail for a while, and then there were people who argued that, well, during Prohibition, this, by the way, was an allegation that we'd come across, the other people and I who I'll identify briefly, who've been, it's a kind of collective effort in trying to figure out Fred Crisman, that you would come across initially these anecdotal statements that Fred Sr., some people thought he was a nice guy, but he was perhaps not particularly honest. There might have been some connections. He might have been involved in criminality. And that was before you actually come across the criminal record that suggests that talk had some substance to it.
Right.
And so I think there was a sort of interesting family dynamic which was going on throughout this. And one of the things that Fred the Younger was likely exposed to. Now, here again, you're sort of speculating based upon the evidence that you have, that he was exposed to a certain degree of at least low-level criminality.
Sure.
That was something, that there was a certain dishonesty which was inherent in his family situation.
Sort of like our other friend in the Northwest, Riconosciuto, right?
Yes. Okay. Who will become connected
Interesting parallels, yeah.
And Fred Crisman later on, the Fred Crisman we're talking about, will be connected with a lot of people who are much like his father. They're businessmen, but always just kind of on the edge of legality.
Okay.
And so there was something a little bit questionable. People will raise questions about their business methods in the same way they'll raise questions about Fred Crisman and what he's involved in. But I think that came to him early.
Okay.
And it's too much to say that that's made him, everything else that follows is based upon that. But there was the example which he
opens
had
the possibilities
within the family. Okay. So what else do we know about the younger Fred? He was suspended from high school, or he left high school. Now, this is again one of those things that isn't entirely clear. Was he kicked out, or did he leave? Did he quit?
Okay.
So you get this, there are people, and this comes from people who went to school with him, that assumed that he was suspended.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went and joined the Civilian Conservation Corps. He went out and joined the CCC for about a year, but then came back and finished in another high school. I think he actually graduated from Vail High School in Oregon.
36, 37?
I think he doesn't graduate until 39.
Okay.
38 or 39. And he'd worked on the railroad for a while. There were other early sort of adolescent acquaintances that remembered him having mental issues, some sort of and so what does that mean?
Yeah.
If I was to summarize it, you would probably find people living in his community who would have said, there's something not right about that Crisman kid. That is probably as close as you can get to summing it up. Although nothing bad. Other people thought he was fine. I mean, there's no whole. He was not a juvenile delinquent. He doesn't seem to have been caught up in any sort of petty criminal activities on his own. Early on, there is a little issue that people would mention, that he would borrow small amounts of money, or he would run up small debts and then run out on them.
Okay.
So if you lent Fred Crisman $5, don't expect to ever see that again. It would be unlikely that would ever appear.
Okay.
Maybe that was something he learned from Dad. Maybe that's just because he tended to be careless about his personal finances. Other statements that sometimes come up was that, he was bright. Yeah. He struck people as inquisitive, generally likable, impulsive. Mm-hmm. That comes up more often than not. At some point as a teenager, he managed to shoot himself in the left arm.
Whoa. No.
With a rifle, and he had this scar. Now, that will figure in later in one of his early stories.
All right.
But the real story is pretty simple. I don't know, he was playing around with a gun, whatever it was, he managed to shoot himself in the left arm. So he has a bullet hole that goes in and out of that, and that's mentioned. So how do we know that? Well, in 1940, he filled out his draft card, and one of the things that you had to do was to notice any kind of, identifying marks or scars. And one of the things that's noted is bullet wound scar left arm. So that was there in 1940. He attempted to join the Army before World War II broke out for the U.S. This was a very confusing thing because we found what appeared to be. We first thought that there were two guys named Fred Crisman in Oregon, one of whom had volunteered for the Army in July 1940. Okay. But then the Fred Crisman that we knew was our guy had filled out a draft card as a civilian in October 1940. So it didn't, if you were already in the Army, you're not going to fill out a draft card.
Yeah.
So what had happened, it appears from piecing things together that he did indeed enlist, but then for some reason that enlistment was canceled, and it may have had to do with health reasons. Don't know what it was.
For his bullet hole?
So he enlisted in the Army, but then not. So in October, he's back. He's a civilian again. He's a student at Eastern Oregon State College in La Grande.
Okay.
And then eventually he goes on. He's married. Marries a girl from a good family in the local area. Everybody seemed to think her family was great. Crisman family, not so much, but her family was fine. And then in May 1942, he is drafted into the U.S. Army. Well, again, here there's some confusion whether he was drafted or enlisted.
Yeah,
he's not entirely, but he ends up in 42. He goes into the Army. And he goes into initially the infantry and then the artillery.
Okay.
But then eventually ends up in pilot training and goes into what is then the Army Air Corps, later the Army Air Force. Right. And so again, for anybody who's uninitiated into this, during the Second World War, in fact, up until 1947, the Air Force, as we think of it, is a branch of the Army. So if you're in the Air Corps or you're in the U.S. Army Air Force, as it was later called, you're in the Army.
And, just from personal experience, I will say throughout the Northwest, and I'm sure everywhere, but particularly because the Northwest is a coastal area, you had a lot of Army Air Corps bases and auxiliary bases stationed, not just McCord Airfield, but things out in Vampire Land of Forks, Washington, and all up and down.
They built them everywhere. And the town I grew up in, Central California, was the heyday of the whole town. I think was when there was an air base there during World War II. My parents would talk about that was when things were fun. Okay. There were all these air cadets, and there were all these bars and restaurants. And then the war ended, and then all the fun stuff.
They went home.
But so he ends up eventually. So he becomes a pilot. He's trained as a pilot in Lancaster, California, and then eventually, after moving around to this or that, he ends up in a thing called the Second Air Commando Group.
Commando Group?
Air Commando Group. Now, it's purely an aviation unit.
Okay.
And the training for that takes place in Florida, near St. Petersburg. So he's still there. As in 1944, he's still in early 1944. He's still in Florida undergoing training. How do we know that? Well, because he goes AWOL for a while, and it has to be. It's he just didn't come back on time.
Okay.
And no serious repercussions. He was not court-martialed. He was just confined to barracks for a while and docked a bit on pay. But that was the only thing you can find in his military record, which isn't pretty much spotless. So later on in 44, he is sent with the 2nd Air Commando Group to the rather remote and largely non-American China-India-Burma theater. So he's stationed in India and then operates mostly over the Burma front with the 2nd Air Commando Group. And what that group did, it was a combination. It had fighter squadrons, it had observation and liaison squadrons, and it had transport squadrons. And he is connected to a transport squadron.
Okay.
He actually becomes, he's promoted to 2nd lieutenant, and then he becomes 1st lieutenant. The end of the war, he actually commands a flight of about 6 planes within this transportation squadron. Although most of the planes he seems to operate are light liaison planes. And these are like bush pilot Piper Cub things that fly in and out of remote jungle areas. It does entail a certain amount of risk. And so if you look through his military records, you find that he got at least 2 Purple Hearts.
Wow.
During that. He was shot down a couple of times.
Huh.
He later claimed, and here's one of the things he would claim, he specifically claimed to have flown 211 combat missions. And if you actually do the calculation among the number of known combat missions flown by his unit, that's probably about right.
Okay.
I mean, he seems, this is amazing. He actually seems to be telling the truth about that.
Well, that's not something you need to lie about, right? I mean,
well, but he does lie about being a fighter pilot. Okay, he will always claim that he was a fighter pilot. And I have to say this, that there is no evidence whatsoever that he ever flew any aircraft that could be described as a fighter.
So for these flights to get the Purple Heart, he was essentially ferrying folks in an active combat zone?
A lot of it is recon.
Okay, all right.
That's what much of it
recon.
was. Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
So, these are light sort of observation, mostly observation planes that are going on a recon, but they could also be used for what was called liaison duty, which was mostly flying officers in and out. And I think he was doing all of those things on demand.
Well, the first thing that pops in my head, which is, reconnaissance, aircraft. It's not yet formed, but it will. I guess the OSS was there.
The OSS is very prominent. And that brings up something else, is that he would later claim to have, if you have to watch the wording, worked with the OSS in Burma. Now, that doesn't say he was in the OSS. He worked with them. And that, again, is probably true, because the OSS, again, this was largely a British show.
Okay, yeah.
The India-Burma theater was. There was an American presence, and what the 2nd Air Commando Group did was to largely provide air support, recon, observation, transport, and some combat support for the British 14th Army.
Okay.
So he received British medals. He got an American Distinguished Flying Cross. He got a British Distinguished Flying Cross. He got a British Empire Medal. The whole thing. So his statements to have worked with the OSS, by which he clearly was implying he was in the OSS, he was not.
Yeah. Because
OSS wartime personnel rosters have been declassified, and there are Crismans. There is no Fred Lee Crisman. So he was never in the OSS, although he probably knew people who were and flew them around.
So, as an aside, real quick, so OSS is Office of Strategic Services.
Right.
So who is doing, is this Bill Donovan's kind of adventure squad who's doing this sort of?
Yeah, there are a couple of the OSS units that operate there. One of them is OSS unit or 101, and then there's also 102.
Okay.
And those are the groups that often cooperate. Well, among the other things that the OSS is doing in Southeast Asia is that they're collaborating with groups like the Viet Minh,
Right, yeah.
Ho Chi Minh's future Vietnamese communists that are fighting the Japanese.
Right.
And that was one of the issues, that there were these issues between this sort of British equivalent to the OSS, the sort of British quasi-military intelligence operations in the Americans, is that the Americans, the OSS, were much more willing to cooperate with local, let's say, anti-Japanese, but also anti-colonial resistance groups. So in the case of the Viet Minh, for instance, the Viet Minh didn't like the Japs.
Yeah.
They also didn't like the French.
Yeah.
And therefore had no real interest in seeing the French empire restored. And in the same way, the British often felt that the OSS was way too friendly with interests in Burma or even in India that were, they were also anti-Japanese but anti-British at the same time.
Yeah.
And Crisman would later argue that he was actually brought in some way to mediate disputes between the British and the Americans. He might have been present when some of these disputes were going on. Now, keep in mind, you can't prove that. It sounds unlikely, but you can't disprove it either. And I'd go back to that, every now and then Crisman is pretty much telling the truth. He's being fairly straight about what he's saying.
Yeah.
I doubt that he was ever used as a negotiator. I mean, keep in mind, this is an American first lieutenant.
Right.
So it's unlikely as to why he would be brought into any kind of... But he was probably aware of those differences that were taking place.
Varying, I've never been in arbitration or not mitigation. What am I thinking of? But maybe he's carrying messages, right? Maybe something like that. Oh, therefore I was part of dispute negotiations.
He was in a position to hear and see a lot of things.
Yeah.
And people would probably talk to him.
Yeah.
And so again, while he's not part of the OSS, he was close enough to people who were that he might have. Yeah. He picked up a fair amount of the lingo.
Right.
To perhaps make that more convincing later on.
And for his later exploits, would you assume, because I'm assuming that if you're rubbing shoulders, maybe you make friends, and maybe that opens up.
He might have made friends who might have seen value in him later on. Yeah. And also keep in mind, he's largely a bush pilot. He's a guy who can fly small planes in and out of remote areas.
The CIA.
Who might possibly have a use for those talents? Now, oddly enough, that's not one of the things he ever admits doing. He never claimed, but maybe he never admits doing that because that's what he was doing.
I was going to say,
but let's all good. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but there are things that Crisman doesn't say that are perhaps more interesting than what he does.
That makes Maury Island seem more significant, which we can talk about when we get there. But aerial phenomenon, you're kind of jumping into anyway.
Well, he's a pilot. He knows he knows what flies and what doesn't.
Right.
So he's out of the service in. Well, the unit is disbanded in November of 1945. And then he comes back and I think is mustered out in, January, February 1946, along with lots of other people. Now, there is this little interesting gap there. Okay, notice that the 2nd Air Commando Group is disbanded in the Far East in October, November 1945. He doesn't show up again stateside until 2 or 3 months later. Now, the reason why that's interesting is where was he in between?
Right.
And there are claims that will come up later that he was in places like Japan or that he was in Saigon, and that's where he was first sent to some sort of intelligence school, where he was given some kind of specific intelligence training.
Okay. Right.
There's no evidence. There's not a single trace of that in his military record, in the sort of standard record.
Would that sort of stuff be declassified at this point, or would it even be acknowledged? I mean, was he discharged and then he's discharged and then he's He disbanded for 3 months, or
no? His unit is disbanded.
Okay.
So the Second
So he's
Air
not
Commando
just-
Group. So he's
okay.
he's still in the Army, still in the Army Air Force, but the unit he was part of isn't functioning any longer.
Okay.
And he'll actually argue that he flew his last combat mission on the 26th of May, 1945, which doesn't seem to be quite right.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that is that the 26th of May is the exact day that he actually entered the Army in 1942. That's where I think he gets that date from.
Okay. He's just,
So
Remember,
I enlisted in the Army on the 26th of May,
and
then I flew my last combat mission on the 26th of May. That's a little sus.
yeah.
So his chronology is always fairly loose in those circumstances, but there'll often be those kinds of the idea of sort of borrowing bits and pieces of things from the legitimate record and then plugging them into more fantastic events. So maybe this is the time to argue what was his later story about this? So he gets out. He's mustered out in early 46, reunited with his wife, and gets a job pretty quickly with they're back into the Tacoma area, and he gets a job with the Washington State Veterans Bureau.
Okay.
Now, Crisman will later describe himself as a special investigator for the Washington State Veterans Bureau.
It's like fraud claims, or what are you investigating?
Well, what he actually worked with were veterans who were often looking for jobs, guys in the same boat as him. But he was most interested in veterans who had some sort of run-in with the law. Guys who'd gotten arrested for something or other, and he would often act as a kind of advocate for them. And the descriptions people would note is that he was very effective in that role. So they thought sometimes he got a little bit too invested in this person or that person. But he did a good job. The guy he worked for said that if I was going to rehire him, I had to let him go because our budget got cut back. But if I could, I would rehire him with no real hesitation.
Yeah.
But here again, there's a little notation that it actually turns out that Crisman's job description for the Washington State Veterans Bureau was simply an interviewer one.
Wow.
He interviewed. He was not a special investigator.
Right.
At no point did he hold a position or wield a badge that said special investigator. So he's making things a little bit more interesting. In the same way that claiming to be a fighter pilot is, sexier than claiming that you were a liaison plane pilot. Everybody wants to be a fighter pilot. And all of those things are minor. They're fairly minor exaggerations that I think would be more or less forgivable in most circumstances. I'm not sure I could blame a guy for saying that he was he did get shot down twice.
Well, if you do, and if you're doing things that are in relation to, he got Purple Hearts out of it. I don't know why you need to church it up a little bit to make it sound cooler than it is.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Fred Lee Crisman always wanted to be something more than what he was.
Don't we all?
Or yes, but he goes out. He's just going to make himself that way. Most of us just suffer that in silence.
Well, so the investigator thing, I didn't put this together the first time, but do you think part of that was he was actually doing some investigation, whether it's part of his duty or not, and was that in relation to?
It wasn't his job, apparently, and that if you sort of put these together, what it was is that he would interview these people. So he'd bring in, and he was interviewing this veteran. I don't know, who'd got arrested for car theft or something. Or one thing, one guy was arrested for stealing a radio, and Crisman would get very involved in their cases and then would actually begin to advocate for them with the cops and others. And so he sort of went beyond what his job was. And that seems to have been connected to some of the statements by others that he didn't always use the best judgment.
So it's not the first two things that popped up. One is, I think, more plausible, which is like Dad was a military veteran and petty criminal. So maybe I have some kind of childhood soft spot for
petty criminals.
Yeah,
maybe that
with
might
a
have
military
been it.
background. Maybe I see myself in him, or is it the more conspiratorial? He's a spotter.
Well, there's that possibility, and this is a good a time to bring it up. Is that one could speculate on only that based upon other accusations that will be made. Now, Crisman's job was, as an interviewer for the Veterans Bureau, was specifically to look out for guys who had some kind of, social problems. Maybe they were involved and, had problems with the law.
Yeah.
People who might be willing to do illegal things in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
That you're, in other words, you're specifically looking for people who have a fairly broad conscience, might be willing to commit at least minor criminal actions, or could possibly be recruited for something else. Just keep that in mind as a possibility. But see, you got a couple of choices. One is that Fred Crisman just got overzealous with his job and became an advocate for troubled veterans that otherwise was not part of his job description, or that he went beyond his job description for the state because he was actually performing some other duties.
Right.
This was his way of sort of recruiting or ingratiating himself with these people.
If somebody's listening to this, I would assume that they're here because they already are affiliated with a lot of this kind of information. Maybe not Crisman specifically, but folks who would be inclined to do things for the intelligence community or something like that. And the person that pops into mind recently was the Tom. He wrote the book on Manson recently.
Tom O'Neill.
Thank you. But I was watching an interview where they were talking about all of these different folks who may have been handlers for Manson. Manson himself was some kind of informant for somebody. We don't know who. So I'm just curious if he's got this. Is he boasting, or is he working on behalf of something?
You just don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be one or the other. Crisman was the term that can be used for people like him is that they're fantasists.
Okay.
Which is a fancy term for a particular type of liar, a kind of compulsive liar. And the difference is arguably that a fantasist sort of buys into their own lies. At some point, they're sort of a Walter Mitty. They kind of believe these stories. They make up stories about themselves, and they embody them enough so they begin to believe them. And therefore, what they're doing isn't active deception. It's just their imagination having taken over. Okay. I'm not really sure I buy that. I'm not sure a fantasist exists.
Yeah.
In Fred Crisman's case, I think he knew he was lying every time he told a lie. It was just whether or not it satisfied his ego. But the other thing that's manifest in this period is that, so he works fairly briefly, just for a matter of months, for the Washington State Veterans Bureau, doing something. And then he decides he's going to run for coroner.
Okay.
Why? I don't know. He decides that he thinks that the existing coroner is not good for young business types.
What?
I don't know why that would have anything to do with it. And he loses. He doesn't get anywhere in this. But the interesting thing is that in running for coroner, the newspapers publish a kind of candidate bio. And it's in this candidate bio where he says, I was a fighter pilot. I flew 211 missions, and I worked with the OSS. And that's one of the first places you see these claims come up. Now, I don't know how many political candidate bios could always be scrutinized for any sort of exaggerations which is taking place. But I think it's interesting that he says this about himself as early as 1946. But he also had another interest. He's really interested in science fiction.
Okay.
He seems to read a lot of what were the sort of sci-fi pulp magazines. And he's certainly acquainted with one important one called Amazing Stories.
Okay.
And what that magazine had begun publishing a couple of years before were a series of stories that become, they're part of something called the Shaver Mystery, So anybody listening to this who has some sort of background in American sci-fi, you've probably heard of the Shaver mystery, and you have a distinct opinion about it. For those who don't, it was a series of stories by a man by the name of Richard S. Shaver, an artist who had also spent a lot of time in mental institutions, a guy who was probably by any kind of general description crazy to some degree, but nevertheless, that doesn't mean that he's wrong.
Well, I was going to say, I like that artist.
And Shaver came up with these stories, which he sold. There was Amazing Stories and other sci-fi magazines, all part of the Ziff Davis collection of magazines. The managing editor of that was a very, very astute, kind of savvy guy by the name of Ray Palmer.
I know that name.
Yeah, Ray Palmer was a controversial figure because Ray Palmer's job was to increase the circulation of his magazines.
Yeah.
The simplest way to describe it is that the Shaver mystery, these stories spun by Richard Shaver, told about his experiences with an insidious underground race of beings that he called the Darrows.
Okay.
And these were the remnants of a kind of ancient lost civilization which had retreated to the caverns inside the earth, and then spent their time now basically messing with surface people by using influencing machines to, make us crazy. Interesting. So this was how Shaver explained all of his mental issues, is that this was because the Darrows in the caverns in the earth were beaming these things into his mind.
Can I just throw an aside? Personal story. I was talking to my mom about a great aunt, I believe, who herself was schizophrenic, and her biggest hallucination was little green men descending from the sky and landing in the front yard. Okay, this is maybe the 50s, 60s. So I'm just throwing it out that, is this, in relation to some lore? I mean, we've talked about people under the ground in caverns. That shows up all over the place. I don't know the history.
It's very common. The whole idea of, this is something that might work into some future episode. The whole concept of influencing machines. There's actually a term for these.
Okay.
Influencing machines are some sort of contraption that supposedly plants voices in your heads, or plants ideas in people's heads. And references to those, recorded references, go all the way back to the late 18th century.
Really?
The thing called the heirloom gang.
Well, yeah, we definitely got to do one of that.
It's this guy who believes the same sort of thing. That these people, the tunnels under London are using these heirlooms and these other devices to mess with his head. And he was in Bedlam, so nevertheless, a fairly respectable man. Now, the thing about this is that Shaver's stories immediately created a controversy because hardcore sci-fi fans, the sort of nuts and bolts types. Mm-hmm. Now, the one that thinks about rocket ships and exploring other planets. They just absolutely hated this. They thought it was a stupid story by a crazy guy that Palmer was just published in order to increase circulation. Yeah. And in that latter part, they were certainly correct. But what it did is that it did increase circulation, because what happened is that Amazing Stories started getting all of these letters from people going, yeah, that happened to me. I know exactly what you're talking about. So Shaver's specific thing was that he was working in a kind of war plant using an arc welder. And he claimed that whenever the arc welder was on, that this somehow created some kind of electrical current, so he could actually hear the Darrows talking. Okay. And he'd hear this. So his welding machine caused voices in his head, and it just gets wilder from there.
Okay.
But highly improbable stories about highly improbable things. But nevertheless, there was this huge response of people who said, yes, this has happened to me. And circulation went up. And so Palmer just wanted more and more of these stories.
Right.
So Crisman is reading these stories. And he's apparently so taken about them that he writes, the first letter is anonymous, but we know it's him. He writes a letter that appears in the letters column, and this I think appears in 46. So soon after he leaves the service, going, yeah, I know, but you should really lay off this whole shaver thing because it's dangerous. You don't know what you're getting into. When I was in Burma during the war, a friend of mine, basically went into this cave and we were fighting these weird beings, and they shot at us with these strange sort of weapons. And he claims that he was wounded in his left arm.
Oh,
actually, what he says is that I have 2 9-inch scars on my left arm as evidence of battling the Diros in these caves.
Interesting.
Now, he doesn't have 2 9-inch scars,
right,
but he does have a bullet wound in his left arm. So I think that's where that idea came from. But, here again is this little kind of detail. If you see this story referenced about Crisman, it will often be, Fred Crisman encountered Diros or some sort of strange underground creatures in a Burmese cave during World War II. But if you actually look at his original letter, he never says that. This is why going back to the original, what he says is that after my last combat mission in May 1945, my buddy and I got leave to basically go to Kashmir, all the way to the other side of India.
So he's giving a account of where he was.
Yeah,
during
he mentions
this time.
Kashmir. He mentions a town called Rudak, and he mentions the northern foothills of the Karakoram range, which puts you right up on the border between what was then India, today Pakistan, and Tibet.
Okay.
Actually puts him in Tibet.
Okay. Oh.
Now, I'm not saying that this makes a huge amount of difference as to whether it was non-existent Diros. Okay.
Yeah.
We're talking about something that didn't happen.
Okay.
Almost certainly. That he imagined fighting Diros in Burma, but was actually talking about in Kashmir. But it's interesting how he crafts this whole story. I mean, he actually lays it out, and he names places, and you can sort of trace the route on the map, how he would have gotten there. And remember, that's one of the things that can make a story seem fairly convincing, if there's a fair amount of detail. I mean, so who would make up this whole story? Why would he make up this whole thing about going to Kashmir? Just because he does.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, it sounds like somebody who calls into Art Bell,
Yeah. And then in the following year, in 47, in fact, just before the Maury Island thing again, he'll still be on this kind of shaver mystery kick.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one where he claims that he's just come back from Alaska, where he battled more Diros in a cave, and his friend Dick was killed.
So then he does talk about battling.
Yes, and he sort of acknowledges that he wrote the previous letter.
Okay.
So he's enthused about this, and I should bring in the much of the newer information I have about Crisman. In fact, a lot of my sort of more recent interest in him, I'd run into him on and off, and would sort of pay attention to him, but didn't really pay that much attention. And it's really with working with a couple of other people, most notably Adam Gorightly, who's putting all of this together, I think, in a book. That's the idea.
Okay.
And then also a former Air Force officer and a former professor at a college just down in Lewiston, Idaho, Larry Happinen, who was involved in a lot of this. And so Larry has a lot of puzzle pieces. Adam has some. I have a few. And we sort of put these things together. And it's been a very interesting experience of what happens when you get people with a common interest sharing information.
Yeah.
As opposed to hoarding it. And when you do that, suddenly these whole, there are things that, Adam and I were looking at, and we just really couldn't explain it. And Larry goes, oh, yeah, I got a piece of paper in my, I've got a letter that talks all about this. And these things can then all become clearer than they were before. So I would just want to give credit where credit is due, is that much of the information I'm talking about today really comes through working with and through the efforts of Adam Gorightly and Larry Happinen. So Crisman is one of the things that Larry Happinen noted is that Crisman often seems to like to be associated with things that he likes.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess that's not too odd. So he's really taken by the Shaver mysteries, and so he creates this whole idea that he has actually some kind of connection to it.
Yeah.
But notice he's very much a sci-fi guy. And this is something that will continue all the way on up through the 1950s, and I think all the way up to the end of his life, is that he's quite an avid consumer of that. And in fact, one of the things that Larry Happinen came across, noted recently, was a letter that Crisman writes to someone around 1961 or 1962, and he actually talks about attending a sci-fi convention in Seattle. And he gives this kind of review of this.
I gotta drill down on the history of American sci-fi, because I'm so, there's Lovecraft, and then there's stuff like Amazing Stories, and then by the 50s it's like, oh yeah, robots. So I mean, what is his arc here? Did we? Is that nerd?
Happinen's idea, which I would agree with, is that Crisman's one of his secret desires was to be a sci-fi writer.
Okay.
But somebody else, he just wasn't very good at it. He was really interested in these things, and I don't know. Maybe that was his unfulfilled destiny.
Yeah.
But he liked the Shaver mysteries. Created a big controversy in American sci-fi because there were people like, give you an example. One of the chief people who hated the Shaver mysteries and Ray Palmer was the writer Harlan Ellison.
Okay.
And Harlan Ellison took a much more, he wanted sci-fi to be a serious medium about serious things.
Yeah.
And he thought that the Shaver stuff was just
fantasy.
Gobbling. It was just it was fantasy.
Yeah.
And it had no place in science fiction.
Right.
And that and I would say that Harlan Ellison and his ilk pretty much sort of won that debate. And then by the mid-50s, increasingly the sci-fi moves away from it. And one of the things that Crisman is then complaining in 1961, I think it was like the 19th World Science Fiction Festival in Seattle, or convention.
Yeah.
And he's complaining is that, well, it was interesting here, but there weren't enough young people. There were way too old and middle-aged people here. And he really wanted to see more young people, and he thought that the reason that there weren't more young people was because current science fiction had gotten away from what its core appeal was, which he described as space opera.
Yeah. Okay.
That you really wanted to have, which is more like heroic, sword and sorcery,
right,
with rocket ships.
Yeah.
I guess. And that gives you an idea as to what he liked and the kind of sci-fi that he wanted to see. And he thought that sci-fi, having gotten away from that, was then losing its appeal to younger people.
Okay.
Which may or may not be valid. But so he keeps up this interest in it. And so then you have this brings us right up to Maury Island. So first, on the 24th of June, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, a pilot from Boise, Idaho, is flying over Mount Rainier near Puget Sound, right over the same area. And this is where he famously claims to have seen 9 flying discs, actually more like flying crescent rolls.
Yeah. I thought they were supposed to be like a fixed wing, like it's all one.
Well, they look like a crescent. Okay, they're not a saucer. Yeah. They're not really a disc.
Well, you say crescent roll, I was thinking
they're a crescent. They're sort of flying crescent, which he describes as acting like saucers that you were skipping across a pond. Yeah. But flying saucer comes out of this.
Right.
So, and Arnold's account is still one of those that's given, he didn't know what they were. He just said that I've seen these things, and as an experienced pilot, I knew that they weren't behaving like, these weren't aircraft in a normal sense. But that's where Kenneth Arnold sort of becomes, this is the ground zero of American ufology.
Doesn't Arnold have some weird background or something like that? I mean, aside from, I thought he was connected to some kind of military or something. I mean, I guess that was.
He ran a sort of fire equipment company in Boise. They managed fire extinguishers, and that was one of the reasons that he ran around. And I think he certainly knew people in the Air Force.
Yeah.
I was in fact looking at that earlier today, trying to remember whether Arnold had ever whether he was in the U.S., whether he was in the Air Corps during World War II, or whether he simply knew people who were. He certainly knew people who were, and that will in a moment become an important point.
Yeah.
So Arnold's story had been covered again by Ray Palmer
Okay.
in Amazing Story. So there's a connection between Arnold and Ray Palmer. We already know that Crisman had also had some correspondence with Ray Palmer. And so Arnold's sighting on the 24th of June, 47, makes a big splash. This sort of begins the whole saucer things. Well, remember that from Crisman's view, this is very much like space opera.
Yeah.
All right. So
Right.
the interest in sci-fi, then the interest in potential alien craft, and he likes to be associated with what he likes. So the basic story about Maury Island, first of all, what is it and where is it? Maury Island was an island, sort of, but now it's essentially a peninsula, which is connected to the larger Vashon Island. But it's just right across, just across from Tacoma, very much in that area in Puget Sound. And at this time, Crisman had some kind of business association with a man by the name of Harold Dahl, D-A-H-L.
Okay.
And Harold Dahl, according to the standard Maury Island story, operated a boat in Puget Sound. And it was part of a kind of log patrol, kind of harbor patrol boat. What it actually did, it's not part of the harbor patrol. It was a boat that supposedly went into Puget Sound and collected stray logs.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of
That's
timber
a whole-
came down,
yeah.
logs would get loose, they were hazardous in navigation.
That's a
And there
business.
were people who would go out and collect them and then return them
Yeah.
or bring them to the municipality to sell, and they get paid so much
Yeah.
per log.
There's a whole History Channel or Discovery Channel show about, swamp log guy.
Swamp log.
That
Okay,
kind,
so
that kind of
they
thing,
were
yeah.
sort of not exactly swamp loggers.
There was a
but-
swamp, but yeah. But
But there are lots of questions. Harold Dahl did own a boat. Apparently, it wasn't operative.
Yeah.
It's not
okay.
really clear whether this boat ran. There's no record of he or Crisman having, they certainly didn't have a business license to do this.
Sure.
And then the other question is, was Dahl working for Crisman or was Crisman working for Dahl? So the one thing that we know is that there was a boat and it was owned and registered to Harold Dahl, not to Fred Crisman. There's no record of them actually having a business license to do anything. That doesn't mean they weren't doing it. So Dahl argues that on the 21st of June, 3 days, I would note, before Kenneth Arnold saw the flying crescent rolls over Mount Rainier. See, if this story pans out, what's the original Who Saw the Saucers First?
I thought it was after.
No,
Oh.
he's actually saying this was 3 days before.
Okay.
Because they're trying to. The whole purpose in this is they're just trying to get a jump on Arnold.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
They're trying to jump in on the saucer
But
thing.
they didn't come back for like 2 weeks until after.
All right. And by the way, in this period, in June 47, there are flying saucer reports all over the American press. I think in June and July, this is sort of still leading up to the Roswell thing. There are saucers reported in 44 states.
And what are those described like? Are they
It
different?
varies. The saucer idea, the idea of some sort of round, flat, donut-looking thing.
Yeah.
What Dahl is going to describe, he doesn't see crescent rolls. He sees donuts.
Okay.
Okay, they're saucer-shaped. They're kind of flat, but they have a hole in the middle.
Yeah. Okay.
So they're
the
squashed,
classic.
flying donuts.
Okay. Classic UFO.
So he's out in his boat near Maury Island, and he says that his son is on board, and their dog, and one or two, it's never clear, crewmen. Crisman is not there that day.
Okay.
So Crisman never claims to have sent the initial sighting. And, Dahl looks up, and there are these, 6 flying donuts that are overhead, and then one of them seems to have something wrong with it, and it comes down lower to the
They
ground.
always have something wrong with them.
I don't know. They're poorly manufactured. Aliens are overrated. And really, you fly all the way across interstate.
Oh, no,
and then they just crash
If anything,
continuously.
yeah, was that reason? Yeah, I think
They
it would
fall
be
like
us.
leaves out of trees.
I think it's us, but
So this thing is dropping. It basically poops on his boat.
right.
Okay, so first something that looks like tinsel begins
Yeah.
falling out of it, and then eventually it turns into molten rock. Looks like lava
Slag or
coming out of the donut hole.
Okay.
Slag. Interesting. You should mention that.
Okay.
Begins to fall over the boat, and in the process of this, the boat is damaged. His son is injured. Someone gets his arm broken, and the dog is killed.
Wow. Okay.
Although later on, no one produces dead dog, anybody with a broken arm, injured son, and even the boat. Later, when Arnold looks at the boat, he notices it looks inoperative and dirty, but there's no sign of any damage to it.
Okay.
I mean, not like the damage you'd expect if someone had just dropped lava on it.
Right.
So now Dahl says that, I then went and told this to my superior, Fred Crisman, who I work for. Although all other evidence is that it's Crisman who's working for Dahl. So what's this whole thing about?
That's weird.
I mean, why change that?
Wow.
And then he brings Crisman out to Maury Island to show him this, and that's where Crisman says, I saw one of these flying donuts. I didn't see it drop anything, and then I collected a bunch of this now sort of congealed rock, which does indeed look exactly like industrial slag.
Okay.
Which, incidentally enough, is all over Maury Island because this is where people from the foundries in the mainland dumped slag.
Interesting.
So you can just go there and find this stuff.
Yeah.
Anyone who looked at it decided it looked like slag. And so it's then Crisman's idea is that, well, look, let's call up, I don't know whether they called or wrote to Ray Palmer. He will be interested in this story.
Yeah.
And they actually send Palmer some of the slag and go, you should have this analyzed. And he may do it or he may not. It doesn't reveal much of anything. So Palmer is nobody's fool. He's and also I think from his past association with Crisman, he probably doesn't think he's the most reliable.
Right.
So Palmer then hires Kenneth Arnold. He goes, look, I'll pay you $200 and for your gas if you fly your plane from Boise to Tacoma and talk to these guys and figure out whether there's anything to this story. Arnold does. He eventually agrees to it. And then he brings a friend along. He brings another pilot who'd seen a flying saucer, a guy named Emil Smith. And so the two guys, so Arnold and Smith show up in Tacoma and they meet with Dahl and Crisman. Crisman does all the talking. Dahl is Dahl's an interesting guy. He fades into the background very quickly. He seems to want to have very little to do with it. He lets Crisman tell the whole story. Crisman handles all the negotiations, and in the meantime, someone also is telling the press about this. So there are a couple of news reporters that are showing up and want to get involved. And guess who's doing that? Guess who's calling the press?
Crisman, yeah.
All right. So he's going to promote this is the whole story. Arnold doesn't know quite what to make out of this. So he calls some of his friends in the Air Force. And this was a question for me, is I couldn't figure out when and how the Air Force got involved. And turns out it's because Arnold contacted Air Force A2, Air Force Intelligence, what would later become AFOSI, at Hamilton Air Force Base in California.
Okay.
And he goes, "This whole weird case up here, and I think maybe you should send some guys to look into this because I'm not sure what's going on." And they do. They get an armed B-25, and that flies from Hamilton up to McChord Air Force Base. And this is around like the 1st of August by this time. So, and there are two officers. There is a Lieutenant Frank Brown and Captain William Davidson. So Brown and Davidson show up. They're Air Force intelligence officers, and they come in. They interview Dahl. They interview Crisman. They get some examples of the slag, and very quickly come to the conclusion that this is a hoax. They have no and Dahl, in fact, in the meantime has told his wife that it was all a hoax. Mm-hmm. And he's now things are getting kind of weird. It's fairly simple if you look at this. If you put the pieces together as to what was going on. Crisman heard about Arnold's sighting, the whole flying saucer flap, and wanted to get involved in that, and thought he could sell this story.
Yeah,
he had Dahl come up with this yarn. They tried to sell it to Palmer. Palmer wouldn't buy it. Sent in Arnold. Arnold wouldn't buy it. Called in the Air Force. The Air Force show up. Dahl gets spooked completely. And both he and Crisman sort of retreat from this. The FBI is going to show up next.
Oh, great.
By the time the FBI show up, both Crisman, according to the FBI report, and Dahl admit that it was a hoax.
Can't sit there.
We made it up, and it just kind of got out of hand. We didn't intend for it to go this far. And now that supposedly would have been the end of it, but...
You can't let it go.
Flying back. Okay, so Brown and Christensen have completed their investigation, pretty much decided it's a hoax. They're going to fly, and they have to fly back to Hamilton Field because the next day, that B-25 is supposed to be in an air show in California.
Okay.
That's why they return. And they don't get very far. They take off from McCord somewhere over Kelso, Washington. A fire breaks out in one of the engines. 2 other people on board bail out successfully. But Brown and Davidson stick with the plane. It crashes and they're killed.
Huh.
So now you've got this B-25, which has crashed, and you've got 2 Air Force officers who are killed, who wouldn't have been killed if they hadn't flown up there to investigate this hoax. And now there are different. Then the story, Crisman begins to spread more stories in the press that well, this all certainly has something to do. They had the magic slag on board,
the magic,
and that's what caused it, or even the idea that they were shot down.
Yeah.
Okay, there was a 20 millimeter anti-aircraft.
Sabotage.
I don't know why.
From where?
But he's trying. So this is eventually what brings the FBI in.
Okay.
In which Crisman and Dahl retreat from the whole thing and argue it's a hoax. But the Air Force isn't done with this yet. So then you begin to get the correspondence back down in Hamilton, where the head of the A2 branch would have sent the 2 officers there. And the Air Force they're pissed.
Yeah.
In particular because their investigation at McCord shows that Fred Lee Crisman is a reserve captain in what is still at this point the Army Air Force.
Oh no!
So he has a reserve. Yeah,
so they can court-martial him or something.
Well, they're thinking about doing that.
Yeah.
And the very least they decide we can do is that we're gonna kick him out of the reserves.
Yeah.
We're gonna bust him.
Yeah.
Which they do in one of 2 ways. Now this is a kind of interesting thing that if you look in Crisman's service record, it shows that he departs military service, the Army Air Force, in 46 as a first lieutenant.
Yeah.
But he would later claim to have been a captain. And what it is that in this correspondence between at Hamilton Air Force Base, there's the whole idea that they checked and found out that he was a reserve captain. So I think he left active duty as a first lieutenant. In the reserves, he was promoted to captain.
Yeah.
But right at this point, the Air Force is just about to separate. I mean, in September, this is August 47. In a few weeks, they're going to become a separate service, and they're going to decide who goes with them and who doesn't. And they basically, they either bust him beforehand back to lieutenant, or they just leave him behind.
Yeah.
And then he apparently stays in the Army Reserve, but now as a lieutenant again.
Okay.
It's quite confusing.
All right.
But that
sounds
again,
logical,
this seems to explain it.
Yeah.
So they do get back at him. Now, Crisman, by the way, never sticks. He always within later is, if you go up a couple of years in 1950, in another letter, he is claiming that the Air Force investigation was botched and that it distorted everything he said, and that he never said it was a hoax. Or if he did say it was a hoax, it was because he was threatened into saying that. So he backtracks on that immediately. Dahl basically never says anything about this again. But Crisman will insist that, yes, everything in the original story was true. We were just sort of threatened. And he even says, if I had done what they say I had done, then why didn't they bring me up on charges?
Yeah.
Well, because he knows that they considered that and they didn't do it. So, an interesting case of, under duress, it's a hoax. Oh, no, but as soon as the pressure is off, no, it was never a hoax. I didn't really say that. And so that's the Maury Island episode, which really, if you take everything together, there's nothing to it. It was a story that was just fabricated by Fred Crisman.
Yeah, trying to seek
publicity seeking, pure and simple. But it's one of those things that he'll never let go of. I mean, it will still be a part. So remember, in 50, he's claiming that, yes, it really was true. I think in 67, he'll actually attend a UFO convention where, again, it will, on the basis of this was all true. So he'll never give up on that idea. It's something that will become part of his own sort of the myth that he's created for himself. What he then goes into, eventually goes into education. Yeah, he will go to Oregon State University, or actually Willamette College in Oregon, in Salem. He'll get a BA in, I think, history and political science. He will go to law school for a while, and then drop out of that. His son would later argue that he thought it was the only time his dad had ever had to seriously study for something, and it was just too much. So he just, he's not going to go to law. He's not going to do something hard. Yeah. He'll just get a history degree because that's
exactly.
He'll take the lazy kids
route exactly.
and go into history.
Get a BA and
to which there is something to be said. Sometimes that works.
I was a BA who did education, so
he becomes a school teacher. That's what he is. And between, there's still an episode that's going to come. His education basically is cut short. He graduates in June 1951 with his BA. But in the weeks prior to that, guess what? He's still in the Army Reserves. And what's going on in the Korean War.
Right, yeah.
He gets activated for Korean War service.
Okay.
And he's married. He has a daughter by this time. So he gets called up. And this was a very interesting thing to sort of trace what happens to him and where he goes. So turns out, as he would later describe it, he goes back and he's with what is now the Air Force in Korea. But he's not in the Air Force anymore. But he is in the aviation branch of the U.S. Army.
Okay.
So U.S. Army, after the separation of the Air Force, didn't operate basically armed fixed-winged aircraft. It could operate transport planes, helicopters, and light liaison aircraft.
Okay.
Which is what, and especially, so what Crisman ends up in is that through various permutations, he's activated
back doing what he's
to be in the artillery.
Okay. All right.
But then he somehow, I guess they figure out he's a pilot. And so he ends up in the headquarters company of the 45th Infantry Division when it's sent to Korea in 1951.
Okay.
First, it's sent to Japan for more training. For anybody who's interested, the 45th Infantry Division was a reserve formation. It was the National Guard formation from Oklahoma.
Oh, no.
So he ends up in an Oklahoma National Guard Division, goes to Japan, and he's the guy who ferries the commanders around. He flies a liaison plane. He's doing the same thing he did before. And then the 45th Division is sent towards the end of in December of 1950. It's sent to Korea, to the front lines. And this is where he's shot down again. And it kind of explains that he's shot down sort of behind the lines, and he's injured, gets another Purple Heart. He gets a skull fracture. It's hospitalized.
Okay.
May also go through some kind of breakdown. It's and he's hospitalized. And whether that hospitalization is purely for physical reasons or also for mental reasons, is hard to say. I mean, some people have questions as to whether or not this is maybe PTSD of one kind or another.
Yeah.
And so he then ends up back in Japan, where his family, his wife and daughter, are brought over to live with him in Japan for a few months.
Okay.
Now, initially, when we were looking at this, we thought this was kind of odd because that really seemed to be strangely generous
Right.
for the military. I mean, are they really going to go to all the expense to bring over this pilot's wife? And not a fighter pilot's, but a headquarters pilot's family to Japan to live with him. But they do, and this was apparently this was normal. There's nothing exceptional about that. So they live in Japan for a while. There's some of his wife's letters who talk about that. The other thing that she mentions, interesting enough, is that when they come back, so they all return together to Seattle in February 1953. And she makes this statement in one of her letters, is that, this was the end of living in Japan, end of military life, and the end of so many other things.
Is that a relationship reference? Or?
Well, they're going to be divorced in a few years.
Okay.
So and I think this is 53. I think they get divorced sometime around 58. Her grounds for their cruelty, which may or may not mean anything. On the other hand, she was asked years later why she never remarried. And she goes, because I never met a man who was half as interesting as Fred Crisman. So, as difficult as he was,
right.
She still thought he was a very interesting guy.
Yeah.
And then they sort of remained in contact. They also had a son by this time. So they had a son, they had the 2 kids. But they would split up, and then he would then go in. So from 53 all the way pretty much up through 1966, he's teaching in various high schools in Oregon and Washington. He teaches history, English, drama. And he'd also studied drama in college for a while. So he has some background in that. And his educational career is interesting for this reason. He never seems to stay in any place for more than 2 years at a time, often less. So he'll go to work for a school district. He'll be there for a year, 2 years, and he'll quit or he'll resign.
Yeah.
Then he'll go somewhere else and he'll quit or he'll resign. And that just continues place after place. And that made me wonder, how hard up were these school districts for teachers in this period? Because I know that they will check in terms of references.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So if you've got someone who has, and usually his departures seem to have something to do with quarreling with either the superintendent or the principal or the school board. He didn't work well with people. Mm-hmm. There were usually some sort of issues that would come up. So how does he keep getting rehired again and again and again? Because I know full well that someone's going to call up and ask about the last place he worked, or maybe the last 3 or 4 places that he worked. I mean, it's district after district. But he continues to get jobs. So I would suggest that there's basically one of 2 possibilities there. One, these districts really were hard up for teachers, and despite his dubious track record as an employee, they would continue to hire him. Or he was getting help. Yeah. Someone was being told to hire him.
Yeah.
So again, just sort of keep that possibility in mind. But it's but other than that, he seems to be fairly popular with students. They tend to like him. One of the things that's noticed is that he frequently wears his uniform to school, which is interesting because he's no longer in the military at all. He's no longer in the reserve. He'll claim to be in the reserves, but he's not. There's no evidence he's in the reserve, even the reserves, after 53.
That sounds odd.
In fact, in some cases, it's described as an Air Force uniform, even though he's never in the Air Force.
That's weird.
So did he just get a hold of a uniform and wear it?
That's weird.
So, is that just part of his whole fantasist thing? Is this just, again, is he just playing Walter Mitty and he's dressing up in a uniform?
Yeah.
Or is he in some way actually doing this with some sort of not written permission? So, now there is a certain interesting break in his educational work. So he leaves one school district, I think in Washington, in 1960. And then beginning in 1960 through the fall of 1962, he takes a job with Boeing Aircraft in the personnel department.
In Seattle?
In Seattle.
Okay.
And he's very proud of this. And one of the things that's being developed in the Boise, Seattle plant is an Air Force project called the Dynasoar. Dynasoar. Well, it was an early. I can remember this as a kid of reading something about it, and it was supposed to be. It's an aircraft that could be launched and then with rocket assistance could go into space.
Oh, okay.
So it sort of had rocket boosters, and then it would fly in a kind of low orbit. And this was going to be this sort of early. Eventually, it was to be something that the Apollo capsule replaced.
Okay.
It was different sort of approaches to how to create spaceships, which remember to Crisman he's fascinated.
Yeah.
So again, through a letter he writes, we know that he was very aware that this program was going on. And he also described himself as a Boeing engineer. In fact, in the Seattle City Directory for 1961, Fred Crisman lists his address and Boeing aircraft engineer. He is not an engineer.
Yeah.
He worked in the personnel department.
HR guy.
He's not even a supervisor in the personnel department. All he does is basically he deals with hourly employees, and he largely kept track of one person who was shifted to a department from another one. It was Fred Crisman who would handle the paperwork.
Yeah.
But he was completely supervised by someone else. Fairly low-level job, but he styled himself as an engineer. And here's again where the kind of little weird things come in. This is the kind of stuff you can come up with sometimes in public records. So you got this city directory for Seattle, and it's got Fred Crisman at a specific address as a Boeing engineer. But if you go through the directory, you'll find that living at exactly the same address is a fellow who calls himself Raoul Y. Johnsick.
Okay. All right.
Last name is Johnnsic. Johnsick or Johnsich. Apparently that is a real surname.
Okay, I was going to say.
It looks phony as hell to me.
Yeah.
But Raoul Johnsick is an odd combination. And then he lives there with his wife, Doris.
That sounds so too.
What does that mean? Does it mean that Crisman by this time is divorced?
Yeah.
So is he a roomer in a house, or in an apartment? It's not a house. It's in an apartment in which the Johnsicks live.
Yeah.
Who's this Raoul guy?
Renting a room or something?
Yeah. Or is Raoul Johnsick an alias for Fred? Because he would use other names. Particularly, he could create bank accounts and other names.
That sounds shysty.
Well, it's another little story, but way back in 1947, he almost got himself arrested for having opened a bank account under another name and then to have overdrawn it.
Okay.
Which sounds a little bit like something his dad would have done.
Yeah.
But so it's, I don't know, Raoul. Anytime, I knew that at some point somebody named Raoul would show up in this story. So there it is. Don't know what that means.
Yeah.
But I think it's more of, Crisman's sort of constant sleight of hand in these things. But he only works for Boeing again for about 2 years, and then he leaves or is fired. No one is quite certain.
Yeah.
Because it never seems to be quite certain whether he leaves of his own accord or whether he is fired. Most often in the schools, it appears that he resigns, but everyone is really glad to see him resign.
Right.
Usually his principal.
Yeah.
So he then goes back to teaching, and then his last teaching job is back in Salem, Oregon. Goes back there, Cascade High School. And again, he's only there for a couple of years, 64 to 66. Almost immediately begins feuding with the principal because Crisman doesn't want to apparently teach a lot of classes and is constantly trying to angle to get himself put in charge of the new federal money. This is when the whole sort of federal aid to education comes along. And so the federal government is now giving money to public schools. And of course, they need someone to administer these grants or the funds as they come through. And that becomes Crisman's job at Cascade High School. That then leads to arguments with the administration. And then he takes a step over the line because the administration finds out that he has organized a secret club among the students that is meeting on campus after hours. In fact, in the newspapers, they say that he'd organized a secret society among the students.
Nice.
What was that secret society? Well, you do a little more digging, you find that it was a thing called the Para-Ray Society.
Para?
Para, P-A-R-A,
Okay.
then hyphen, or Ray, Para-Ray Society.
Okay.
Well, see, this is just go for one step. Okay, this guy is organizing a secret society among the students. Well, what the hell is that? Well, it's the Para-Ray Society. Well, what the hell is that? Well, what do they do? Spiritualism.
No, you kidding? Come on.
No.
Really?
He had kids meeting after class using Ouija boards.
What?
Something. Or channeling.
What? Jeez. Seems sort of random.
So you would kind of think, I mean, there was different sort of speculation. One idea is that, he organized some sort of branch of the John Birch Society. Although that was actually, I don't think that's secret society enough.
Yeah,
to get that term.
Doesn't seem like that would be a...
I don't think that would be. But no, Para-Ray Society and spiritualism.
Yeah, especially in...
okay.
Where was this now? And you said Cascade. Is that Washington?
Well, Salem, Oregon.
Okay, that's
where
Oregon.
Cascade High School was.
All right. So, yeah, still...
So he gets
still
fired.
enough.
But then he appeals his firing. And there's... I at some point, he dropped the appeal. But then shortly after he's fired... Guess what happens?
He got rehired
The
somewhere.
school burned down.
Oh,
Somehow, there's a fire at Cascade High School, which destroys the administration offices and all the records of those federal programs.
oh wow.
Now, see, that could just be a coincidence, right?
Just like the Air
Just
Force
one
guys
of those
crashing.
things, Fred Crisman. But when you put the words together, Fred Crisman, Para-Ray Society, fired, school burns down. I think there's something.
Yeah.
I don't think that was an accident.
Yeah.
Can't prove it, but it would be room for doubt. Nothing actually happens in that case. So in 1966, his life enters in its kind of last phase. So he's no longer a school teacher. I don't know. He's probably no longer hireable at this point in time.
Burn the school
I think
down.
if your last job, the school burned down, places might be reluctant to hire you. But it's about this time he goes back. He's now back in Tacoma, and he meets this guy. Well, he meets a number of people. One of them was a local businessman by the name of Marshall Riconosciuto, the father of Michael Riconosciuto. And the best I could say, if you want to know who Michael Riconosciuto is, see the documentary American Conspiracy, the Occupus Murders, and you'll find out. And yes, Crisman knew Michael Riconosciuto as a kid. He was Crisman's son, Fred Crisman Jr. Remembers both Father Riconosciuto's coming over to the house often. I mean, how well did Fred Crisman know Marshall Riconosciuto? Marshall Riconosciuto would just come by, open the door, and walk in the house. He didn't even knock on the door.
That's such a weird connection.
And they're an entry. So Marshall Riconosciuto runs a cable TV company. He runs an advertising company. He runs companies that supply various non-drug items to drugstores. Drugstores sell a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Cosmetics and the rest of it. So he wasn't in the drug supply business, but sort of in the drugstore supply business. But he's a little slick. Slimy.
Yeah.
One might say.
Okay.
What's the difference between slimy? There's some people question his business ethics.
Yeah.
But the real character, the real sort of joker that shows up in this mix is a guy named Thomas Beckham. Thomas Beckham is originally from Louisiana, around New Orleans way. He is a career petty criminal. He's a con man. He has he has a long string. He never really did anything bad. There's a statutory rape charge or two. Some forgery.
Yeah.
petty theft. He pretends he's a music star. He claims to have million-selling records. He doesn't. His stage name is Mark Evans. So he's supposedly like either this country or he's a pretend Elvis.
Okay.
But he's always sort of running these scams. And one of the things is to like raise money for a concert that never actually takes place. And Beckham also has this other tendency to form companies, to create corporations. There's all kinds of things like Police Officers Association, parapsychological group, and he can also get all kinds of badges for things. So you want to be a special investigator for the state of Louisiana?
Yeah.
I can get you one of those badges.
Sounds like a con man.
Con man, holds degrees from, diploma mills. I was going to say dubious diploma mills, but are there any diploma mills that aren't dubious? Phony degrees from phony colleges.
Yeah.
So Beckham is all a part of this. If anyone is even more untrustworthy than Fred Crisman, it's Thomas Beckham. Okay. So they immediately go into business.
Yeah.
And through this, Crisman becomes he becomes a bishop in the Universal Life Church.
Okay.
And again, if people don't know what the Universal Life Church was, it basically started in California. Where else? And it was started pretty much as a means of, if you feel vaguely spiritual, but you don't like to have to believe in anything in particular, you can get a degree in divinity from us for $25. I don't know, whatever it was. You could get, I don't know how much being a bishop cost. Probably a bit more than that. Mail order religion, literally, where you just go and but it carried with it. You actually became a member of the clergy. You could cross the San Francisco Bay Bridge without having to pay the toll. Oh. So it was a scam.
Yeah.
And needless to say, Crisman is in the middle of that. And so he and Beckham just go into all of these little business enterprises. And it includes like renting an abandoned theater as a temple for the Universal Life Church, but never actually opening it or having any services there, which was kind of odd.
Yeah. Sounds like a...
But then it also connects them with this group, and the whole connection is through this post office box. So Crisman's Universal Life Church and a group called the Servants of Awareness share a post office box. They get mail at the same place. What are the Servants of Awareness? Well, it turns out they're into, guess what? Channeling and UFOs.
Oh, man.
Yes, they are a channeling saucer cult.
All right.
Which also uses LSD to enhance their experiences.
Oh, wow.
So they're also into psychedelics.
This is Oregon?
This is Washington.
Okay.
Although but they're mostly centered in Washington, but they're also groups in California, Arizona. They also practice a thing called carbogen therapy.
What?
I'd never heard of this. Carbogen therapy. Someone listening to this will know more about carbogen therapy, but as I understand it, it's a combination of oxygen and CO2.
What?
And you put on a mask, like there was somebody who used this, that it was an old mask, a pilot's mask from World War II, and then you would have these high concentrations of CO2 and oxygen pumped into you. You would breathe this, and it would create profound,
I was going to say,
psychedelic effects.
I was going to say there might,
People went through carbogen therapy and they would have flashbacks 20 years later, and the whole thing. But the whole thing was to open you up to spiritual influences. And some people really liked it; other people were totally freaked out about it. But the Servants of Awareness in Washington at the time, Crisman is in some way floating around the edges. Is that they started back in the late 50s, and there's an interesting article in which they describe receiving free LSD in order to carry out their research.
Who gave them free LSD?
I don't know. Who in 1958 just gives out free LSD?
Ah, well.
I mean, LSD is legal still at that point.
Yeah.
But who's the biggest consumer of it? CIA.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Just curious. So I didn't catch this last time, but Riconosciuto's connection to pharmaceutical, like you can still get LSD through a druggist, right? Or is it?
I'm trying to remember the exact year in which LSD becomes categorized as an illegal drug, and I think it's like 64.
Yeah, well,
somewhere around there.
You start to have like more reports about young people having bad effects, and then
once it becomes illegal, that's when Michael Riconosciuto starts manufacturing it in 1968 in his underwater boat drug lab.
Hell yeah.
Literally, it's a boat in I can't remember the Skagit River. I don't know. He's got a boat setting out anchored at a dock in the river, and then you have to go in and enter through the bottom of the boat to get into the lab where he's manufacturing acid, methamphetamine, and all sorts of things. And that gets busted in 70. So he's doing this for 5 years before he gets busted.
Wow.
That was his first bust. That's not the one he lived, but so he's as far back. So he was probably manufacturing acid or something similar even before that.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing here is you've got Crisman, who tangentially, mostly through a shared P.O. box, is associated with a group, the Servants of Awareness, who use LSD as an enhancing element or a kind of sacrament in their effort to make contact with awareness, which is their word for the space being that they communicate with while they're high. And then you've got the fact that Crisman is good buddies with Marshall Riconosciuto, whose son is a drug manufacturer.
Yeah.
So there's something going on there.
Yeah.
And you might assume that Crisman, Crisman, it should be noted, looks like a kind of shorter, fatter version of Jack Webb as Sergeant Joe Friday in Dragnet. So a kind of spark plug version of Joe Friday. Okay. He's got the whole sort of crew cut. He tends to wear the suits. Yeah. Very straight looking guy. Yeah. Doesn't have much to do. You would think this would be the last guy in the world who want anything to do with hippies.
We're not there yet. Yeah.
Except in 1970, Fred Crisman attends a hippie love-in in Eatonville, Washington, and apparently greatly enjoys himself.
Well, of course. Come on.
Where by all reports, drugs, especially LSD, were widely available.
Interesting.
There's a whole thing called what is the Flying M Ranch, run by this local eccentric.
Okay.
But it's run as a political reality because the county you couldn't have a rock concert, but then the guy finds out that you can have a political reality. So he creates a thing called something like the Buffalo Party. And so it's going to be a political rally, but actually it's a huge love-in, and they're going to be bands and acid and all this stuff. And Fred Crisman is there in a tie-dyed shirt.
Oh.
So
I mean, tell me this. So, the counterculture, as far as I understand it, is not necessarily born by this time. This is like what this transitionary period between beatniks and... I mean, you're on the West Coast. You're on I-5.
Well, hippies begin to emerge 66, 67.
Yeah.
I'd say 67 is probably the magical year. That's the summer of love.
You say this is 58.
Well, 58 is when Servants of Awareness tend to go back. And they also go through different names. And they're still around, by the way.
Oh, really?
So I should just say to any current members of Servants of Awareness, I'm talking about things that happened years ago, which I'm sure you no longer have anything to do with. And if you do, you should keep quiet about it. But, it's the same thing. It's like, flying saucers, aliens, channeling. Remember, and what was it that Crisman was doing in 66 at Cascade? He was running a spiritualist society for students. So how not so odd that he's then going to be in some way tangentially mixed up with a group of space spiritualists.
I mean, I guess if you're interested in, space opera in general, spiritualism always finds its way into almost everything, it feels like, which I don't know why that is. I mean, do you? Is that a product?
It's voices in people's heads.
No. I mean, like an interest in it. Like, is that a uniquely, American kind of disenfranchised with mainline religion and people kind of find their way. Steiner's, Christianized theosophy or...
Well, I think the idea that it's the type of thing that appeals to people who have become disillusioned with whatever religion they had previously, and are looking for something else. And you'd probably find that with virtually every one of these groups.
Yeah.
And they're looking for a spiritual awareness or meaning that they didn't have otherwise. But it's the interesting thing to me is that it becomes connected with it's spiritualism now combined with these sort of saucer cults.
Yeah.
When you bring in the whole kind of, it's not the ascended masters anymore,
right.
in this sort of Blavatskyan way, but now, the ascended masters are now the space beings, the space intelligences, right. the space brothers. They all look like angels and they want to make our lives better, but now they're in saucers.
Yeah.
So all of this stuff is kind of brought together, but it fits. I mean, it's one of those things that if you look at sort of Crisman's fixations, the things that he likes, it's sort of what he would be drawn to.
Yeah.
There's a logical reason for him to be there. It's also worth noting that in this same period, along with Beckham, one of these groups that they found is the Parapsychology Research Institute.
Okay.
I think that's right. I know it's parapsychological research. It may not be institute.
This is California.
Yeah, it's a group, and for $5 you can join and you supposedly get some kind of newsletter. Now this is being run out of Tacoma.
Oh, okay.
So he's still quite. I think it shows his interest in that. But another part of his whack pack, as I would call it, the sort of people he's associated with, besides, is a Tacoma used car dealer by the name of Giulio Grassi.
Okay.
And he runs used car lots. He and his brother. He was apparently famous for one time where, like no credit check, no money down. Apparently there were some issues that wasn't exactly true. And then he came under investigation. So at one point when Grassi's car lots and his methods of doing business have come under some scrutiny, he sort of transfers the ownership or management of the lot to Fred Crisman. Fred Crisman at one point is now directed as I'm not sure the owner, but the general manager of what had been Grassi's car lot, just for a while, until the heat's off. And then, of course, there are arguments that, I think because he had an Italian name, of course, there were those who argued that he was a fringe member of the mob.
Right, yeah.
Which...
Maybe.
Maybe. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. I mean, other than and not just taking a cheap shot at an honest Italian American businessman,
right?
But could he have had connections to? Probably.
Wasn't it the case with Riconosciuto as well? Like there were some. I thought in the Octopus Murders it kind of makes some allusions to
Well, he was also friends with Grassi. Again, it's one of those things that so often comes up against slightly shady Italian American businessmen that they have to be mobsters, which is not true.
Yeah,
they can just be shady.
They can just be shady.
They
like
can
the
just be
rest
shady
of us.
businessmen.
Come on.
But it wouldn't. You wouldn't be like, oh, I'm shocked.
Right.
Shocked to find out that there was some sort of connection. It gets into things. Well, this leads us up to 1968, 1969. This is where by this time, Jim Garrison in New Orleans has started his investigation, his probe into the JFK assassination, where he is certain that there is a conspiracy which is at work. And in fact, he finances investigators throughout the country to do this, including in Washington State.
Yeah.
And so there are people who are hired as investigators for the New Orleans district attorney. And so how does Fred Crisman show up in this? Well, in 1967, Garrison's office receives an anonymous letter from Dallas, Texas.
Okay.
And it's basically commenting on the opening of his investigation, which I think began in 66, maybe 67, had been going long. And it goes, well, here's some people you should look into. And it provides a list of names. And some of those are kind of minor figures. The name that keeps cropping up is Sergio Arcacha Smith. He's one of those anti-Castro Cubans who's somehow involved in this. So if you look in the fringes of the whole JFK conspiracy, you'll find Sergio Arcacha Smith.
I thought we were getting into another funny name like Raul.
Raul Johnson. I don't know. Nothing said he was Cuban, but that's always possible. So, but on this list of names, there's, I don't know, I'd say 8 or 9 of them is Fred Lee Crisman. Well, this is where it doesn't say how he's involved, but this is someone who's involved in the plot, and who you should look into. So that's in 67. Then some months later, another anonymous letter appears in Garrison's office, and this one is mailed from Florida.
Okay.
And this is and this is just about Crisman, and it's about the fact of how Crisman is, involved, with the anti-Castro Cubans, and how he was a bag man for $500,000 that actually paid for the assassin. It puts him right in the midst of it as if not one of the assassins, but certainly one of the people involved in actually financing the assassination. Now, the interesting thing is, where do those letters come from?
Yeah.
And there are different possibilities. So one view is that Crisman is writing these letters himself as a way of just sort of creating this bigger danger man image. His Walter Mitty fantasies about being some sort of spy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the Kennedy, he's read about Garrison's case. He kind of likes this, and he likes to be associated with what he likes. And so he makes himself a suspect.
Yeah.
I think that's possible, although, other people will look at the letters and they go, well, they were clearly written by the same person. I don't see that. The first one's is too short to say that it was written by the
Does he have connections to people in Dallas?
Well, yeah, who would have... I think it's more likely that those letters were written by Thomas Beckham.
Oh.
Who, by this time, he's disappeared from Tacoma. He's off in the Midwest. He's mostly in Nebraska. But he has connections in those places. And my hunch, and is no more than that, is that it's Beckham, possibly with Crisman's encouragement.
Yeah. Take my letter.
Who's doing this. Yeah. Or it's someone else entirely. Because now you begin, so the accusations here is that Crisman is a principal figure in the plot to kill JFK. And in doing so, he is connected in a sense with rogue elements of the CIA behind it, with anti-Castro Cubans, and of course with the mafia.
Okay.
They're all a part of this.
Sure.
But then the really critical document shows up in late 69, early 70 around Seattle, a thing often called the Easy Papers. It's really a report. It's a cover letter and a report, which it's dated September 1969.
Mm-hmm.
This is after Crisman has already been subpoenaed. So Crisman is, by the way, subpoenaed by Jim Garrison, goes to New Orleans, testifies, answers a bunch of questions, basically saying, I don't know these people. I've never been there. I don't know this. And Garrison has no actual evidence to prove otherwise. So Crisman basically goes, is questioned, denies everything, goes back.
That's it.
But that made it that's widely reported in the press in Seattle, Tacoma, and in other areas. It makes news all around the country.
Okay.
So his name has been now thoroughly connected with the case. So the Easy Papers, or Easy Paper, is a multi-page report, poorly typed, supposedly by a dissident officer of the CIA, who is very concerned that Crisman and internal disruption agents like him have become a danger to the country, and he wants people to be aware of that. And copies of this begin to appear or are being sent, again, anonymously to people who know Crisman in that area, like members of the Tacoma City Council. He's friends with a number of those. I think Reconasciuto receives a copy of it. So it begins to spread around the area. Somehow, someone takes a copy of it to the agent of the Naval Investigation Service, what's now NCIS.
Okay.
Not Naval Intelligence, but the sort of Naval Criminal Investigation Service. And then that person takes it to the resident domestic CIA office in Seattle.
Okay.
And yes, there is one there.
Yeah.
And so it ends up in the CIA. Supposedly a report from the CIA ends up in the hands of the CIA. It's they cataloged it. Every single page of it in the CIA archive is stamped fabrication, which it probably is. But if it wasn't, what else would they say?
Yeah.
So they do sort of go through and look at this, but the Easy Papers is a whole sort of survey of Crisman's life. And it goes all the way back to his service in World War II, which it reports accurately. It's got him in the 2nd Air Commando Group. It's got his service in the China-Burma-India Theater. It then has him, but it begins to tell a different story. It says that, well, between that time, the unit was shut down and he returned to the States. He was sent to Japan to be trained in a special internal security school, the OSS. Okay. Then in 1947, he is turned over as the OSS is shut down to a successor institution, the CIA. Yeah. And the CIA, under the cover of reserve training, actually sends him to more training schools in places like Washington, D.C., at Fort Belvoir, and then also it mentions him being sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, for training. Now, here's an interesting thing. In September 1950, before the Korean War episode, he does indeed go to Fort Benning for infantry training. That's what it says. So he's called up and he's sent there, and he goes through what is supposed to be an infantry training course. And that may be all that it was. But what all of this means is that whoever wrote the Easy Papers, whoever wrote this report, remember, which is hostile, it's saying all the bad things about Fred Crisman, had access to his service records, which were not publicly available.
Yeah. So it's either somebody
It's either someone who can get access to those records, or the only other person that can be is Crisman, or someone that Crisman shared that information with.
Yeah.
But it's actually referring to things that exist. So it then talks about, that his whole career in the school system was all as part of an internal disruption agent. This was someone who sent in to basically disrupt any kind of political activity or groups that, for some reason, CIA domestic operations didn't like. It's never clear exactly what, I guess it's secret. And that could, that he would be given orders. He would be ordered to resign and go to another place, and a job would be found. That he was being moved around to these places for some sort of specific reason. And then it said that when he went to work for Boeing, it mentions that he works in the personnel office. So they had that right. Yeah. And then it actually mentions the name of a woman that he worked with. And that turns out to be a woman that he actually worked with. Now, and it says that she didn't know that he was working for the CIA. And later on, she was actually... Deanne Woolley was her name, and Larry Happinen talked to her in the 1980s. She was the one that gave him information about what it was that Crisman really did, that he just worked. He did work in the personnel office, but it was a fairly low-level position. Yeah. And she said she never worked with him. She said she only maybe saw him once or twice. Yeah. But somehow her name shows up in this as a collaborator with him. She also had interesting observations about how other people at Boeing perceived him. She noted that at a couple of parties, the impression that people would get is that they thought that he really should be a sci-fi writer. He seemed really interested in sci-fi stuff.
Yeah.
And then he was boastful that he liked to talk about all the famous war heroes he'd been connected with in World War II. He tended to name drop.
Yeah.
Which seems pretty much within character. But her name is in there. So again, Crisman's the only person, or either someone who had access to records about Crisman that were not just publicly available, or Crisman himself is the only way that you could put this report together. But it often strains credulity in all of the things that he's supposed to be doing, but it does basically fit the chronology. So, these mysterious trainings take place in gaps that otherwise don't have a clear explanation for them. So it's one of those things, I think what it comes down to is that just when you assume that Fred Crisman is a consummate bullshit artist of the ages and that nothing he says you can rely upon, then these little things sort of fit somehow.
Well, what about the writing? I mean, you said poorly typed.
Well, the surviving copies are very faint. So the first, they needed a new typewriter ribbon.
Yeah.
It's single spaced. It's reasonably well spelled.
Okay,
but it's just there's nothing in it to me. I've seen other example of Crisman's writing, and this is about like looking at pictures of people and saying that they resemble each other.
Yeah.
And saying that there are distinctive Crisman phrases in the easy papers. I haven't made that careful of analysis, but it doesn't read to me quite the same. It could have been. It doesn't mean that he didn't write it. It's just that I don't see anything that's just obvious.
Well,
okay, there's a phrase here that only Fred Crisman uses.
Are there other papers or examples of this same kind of action happening to other people or about other people? Like, why is Crisman so unique?
Why is he denounced in this way?
Right.
Well, either because somebody really, and there were people who had it in for him.
Okay.
He had made himself, the other thing he does in the late 60s is he begins to involve himself in local politics.
Okay.
So he was a very big supporter of a Tacoma mayor, a longtime political figure named Slim Rasmussen. And around 68 or so on, Rasmussen loses office and a new mayor and a new city manager comes in. And Crisman just absolutely hates the city manager, a guy named David Reynolds, I think. Can't stand him. And goes off and gets a radio show. So he becomes a radio show. It's for a under the name of Dr. John Gold. So he doesn't have the radio show under the name of Fred Crisman. He's Dr. John Gold, using an alias.
Yeah.
And it's station KAYE in Puyallup. And it's essentially it's a kind of call-in radio show, but he spends most of his time bad-mouthing all the people in the Tacoma City Council who don't agree with him. And then he'll subsequently write a book as Dr. John Gold called Tacoma Death of a City, which talks about all the horrible, rotten things, including drug dealing, commie propaganda, sensitivity training in the schools, all of this stuff that the city manager is bringing in, and how we need sensitivity training. Right? It's a whole thing about how sensitivity training is all part of a commie plot.
Yeah.
And he creates this whole story about the biggest LSD bust on the West Coast of one kind or another, which he describes something. It's not a case you can find, but there's something reported in the papers that's kind of similar to what he's talking about.
Yeah.
It's not exactly, but again, you can see where he got the idea.
Right, yeah.
He has a very contentious relationship with the Tacoma News Tribune. And some of the journalists there, particularly a journalist by the name of Ed Jeffords, who just absolutely hates Crisman's guts. And these people do have a kind of vendetta.
Yeah.
They don't like him. They're perfectly willing to get anything bad about him. And it's not too hard to do that. Here's an interesting circumstance. So on, I think, November. It's either on Halloween itself, October 31st or November 1st, 1968, is when Crisman is subpoenaed to appear in New Orleans. I think it's dated 31st of Well, later that night, probably actually in the morning of the 1st, he's pulled over outside Tacoma. And he's pulled over and charged with reckless driving. I'm not sure he's charged with DUI.
Yeah,
he did like to drink.
Didn't he have some DUIs in his that he got out of, like in LeGrand?
He's has a couple of things. Well, he was early. I should go back years before, like 1958 in Oregon.
Yeah. One
of the reasons I think he lost his teaching job is that he was pulled over by a cop or sheriff's, and for what appeared to be drunk driving, and in the process of the arrest pulls a gun on the cop.
As you do.
And he is arrested.
Jeez.
He complains that he has a metal plate in his head, which he doesn't.
He did have a skull fracture, though.
He did have a skull fracture. See, and I don't know. Maybe there was a screw or something in there. See, just when you think that, he's just making up a story about a metal plate. Do we know for sure he didn't have a metal plate?
Yeah.
His son didn't think he had a metal plate, but that might have been where he got the idea. Now, the interesting thing in that case is that he pulls a gun, a loaded gun, on a cop.
Mm-hmm.
It's drunk driving, and he gets off with $100 fine. Which seems
a
little light.
Yeah.
So is that just because they felt sorry for him because of the metal plate, which he didn't have? Or he did? Or is it because someone pulled strings?
Yeah.
So in this 1968, 10 years later, he's arrested. So what does the cop find? He's pulled over for reckless driving, not having a valid driver's license, and then also having an unregistered loaded firearm in the car.
Okay.
So what are his excuses for this? Well, the driver's license is actually from Oregon, where he was registered to vote. So the argument is that he actually did have a valid driver's license, not just a Washington driver's license.
Yeah.
He was driving erratically because he saw the police car behind him, which was unmarked, and he said he had already been shot at before, and he feared for his life, which was why he had the loaded gun in the car, and he thought that these were bad guys after him, and he was trying to evade them. And it's not clear what the dispensation of this case is, other than Crisman contested it, and most of it was, I think most of it ends up being thrown out. I mean, the invalid driver's license isn't going to hold up, and I think the whole thing was eventually dismissed. He did, by the way, the next day show up actually with a gun permit.
Huh.
Which he'd gotten 8 hours after being arrested.
Right.
So, and his idea is that, well, I'd put in a permit before, but it somehow had been lost in the mail or stolen.
Sure, yeah.
So now I went and got another one. But it's an example of sort of skirting the law as much as possible. And I think in that case, he also had some sort of get out of jail free card. And that could have been because he had friends in the police or elsewhere, or it could mean that there was some other hand which was pulling strings for him. But he becomes, so his position as a political activist, radio talk show host who was very hostile to certain figures and also in the press. Now, that reporter, Ed Jeffords, who was certainly one of Crisman's enemies, was also afraid of him. So Ed Jeffords sort of took some of these. Ed Jeffords considered Crisman to be a very dangerous man. And if he didn't believe all of the stuff in the Easy Papers, he suspected that some of it might be true. Now, that's just, if you don't like Crisman, that's telling you exactly what you want to have. But, why would Crisman put ammunition in the hands of his enemies?
Well, if he's just, maybe sociopath is the wrong term, but if he's a fantasist, if he's an attention seeker, right? I mean, if he likes to be affiliated with stuff that he thinks is interesting, and he has this fascination with wanting to be kind of a agent provocateur, a man of mystery, and he also hates. So, I mean, there is like to have I'm dangerous. I mean,
yes, that's the idea that comes up most often, is that he was deliberately trying to create this dangerous reputation for himself to intimidate his enemies.
Right.
Which in Jeffords' case seems to have worked to some degree.
Yeah.
But there are another sort of strange thing that shows up in this Easy Paper report is that it mentions Crisman going to, and this is sometime in the early 60s, around the time of the assassination, going to New Orleans to negotiate with a thing called the Conquistador Company about money that was supposed to show up essentially to finance the assassination.
Okay.
It doesn't say it, but you're supposed to get money from them. Guys, I don't think the Easy Papers actually mention anything about the Garrison case. It oddly doesn't bring that up. But it mentions him going to Las Vegas, somehow the Conquistador Corporation, which was a...
Release the Hounds.
Yeah, let's stop for a second, and I'll go see what's going on. Okay, so where were we?
Crap. The dogs threw me off.
Well, we had a canine interrupt.
Hello, dogs.
Okay, going to come in? All right. So we have been joined by
two co-hosts,
animals who thought that they were abandoned. Hopefully they won't knock anything over.
Yeah.
So the question was, I think, why Crisman would go out of his way to denounce himself, other than the fact that he wanted to make himself look like some sort of secret agent man badass that people will be afraid to mess with. Yeah. Oh, and the Conquistador Corporation.
That's what it was.
Yeah, there we
Thank
go.
you. All right.
So was there a thing called the Conquistador Corporation? Oh, yes, there was. Okay. It was a mafia front.
Oh.
Okay. It was essentially the guy who actually ran it was Frank Costello, the head of the New Orleans mob.
Yeah.
And they built the Tropicana Hotel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think that the fellow who was not only the head of it was a sort of mob associate with the name of Dandy Phil Castell.
Great name.
Okay.
These are great names today.
Yeah, he eventually died of a bullet in the head.
Well, I didn't say
these things kind of happen. Maybe it was an accident.
Dandy Phil, come on.
But yes, so that turns out to be, that's again one of those things that wasn't really sort of common knowledge, but the name gets dropped. So I'm not quite sure how Crisman would know about the Conquistador Corporation, except maybe through his friends like Giulio Grassi and Marshall Riconosciuto.
Right.
It's always possible. So it's an intriguing, my estimation on it is that the Easy Papers overall are indeed a fabrication that they're bringing, but they're a fairly clever fabrication in some way that's digesting a lot of real information. So again, when it says that Crisman worked for the Boeing personnel department, that's true. Now here's the what does it say though that his actual job was? So he's working in the personnel department, but what was he doing? Well, according to this, what he was doing is he was collecting information upon gay executives.
Oh, for
he was trying to find all the gay executives at Boeing who could be possible sources of blackmail or security risks and getting them fired.
Right. Interesting.
And that he actually managed to get a number of people fired on that basis. But this was all under his cover as a kind of low-level member of the personnel department.
And who was he working on behalf of? The CIA in this? He's trying to root up the commies?
Well,
basically?
It's the dissident CIA guy who's supposedly writing this report says that what Crisman works for is some sort of special branch, some sort of secret branch within the CIA, which he calls ISECE, I think 4250. Actually, it's a thing that this is where Easy section comes from.
Okay.
So the Easy Papers, keep reading this, gets its name from the Easy section, and that is this thing IS, generally capital, which supposedly is internal security, then ECE, Easy.
So I mean, is
there such a thing? I've never found it.
That sounds like a super fabrication of like, not only am I a secret agent, I'm a secret agent of secret.
I'm a
agents.
secret agent.
Yeah.
And that what Crisman's job is specifically is a disruption agent. He's an internal security disruption agent, and his basic job is to cause trouble.
Would we say that?
Or to...
Does that exist, do you think? Or is it like guys like Manson were like,
okay, what's true about CIA domestic operations? There still is, but at that time there was a thing called the Domestic Contacts Office of the Domestic Contacts Service.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why you have CIA offices in cities like Denver and Seattle and elsewhere, and what the agents there handle are domestic contacts. Those are ordinary citizens. They can be everything from government officials, teachers, executives.
Is this like debrief stuff?
Usually there were Americans who would travel abroad. Say somebody took a trip to Bulgaria during the Cold War and come back, and they would want to debrief you. And the idea, of course, what the CIA is banned from doing, or is limited from the National Security Act of 1947 that created it, is that it's usually said, well, they can't spy on Americans, which is not really true. What they don't have is they have no police powers.
Yeah. I thought
they can't actually arrest anyone, and they can't investigate anyone.
Yeah, I thought it was illegal to operate, period, on American soil.
Well, unless if there's an American they suspect of being connected to foreign espionage, then yes, you can carry those.
So it's like the
but
FBI.
you have no legal authority. You can't charge anyone with a crime. You can't investigate them. So you would have to work through other existing police agencies.
I was going to say, you refer to like the FBI or something like that, right?
But you don't trust the FBI.
Well, they're not buddies.
So you would then have your own sources of information. Okay. So they recruited assets that were not paid. And the whole idea was this. These are American citizens who are voluntarily giving information to the U.S. government patriotically. Therefore, they don't work for the CIA. Yeah. They're just people who are giving money. Or not giving money. They're giving information. So they're not getting any money. It's sort of skirted that. They really like recruiting people in academia.
Yeah. My own stepdad I know has been debriefed at least once, but he does a lot of internet. He goes to China and stuff like that for DOE stuff.
Well, what it could do, let's say you would recruit people in the faculty to essentially spy on other members in the faculty, and they would just voluntarily hand information over.
Now, was that
so? It's not just being debriefed about a trip you took to Bulgaria; it's about what other people in the place where you work are doing and talking about.
So, was that more like McCarthy era kind of? We gotta root out the Reds, or was that just kind of like?
Oops. There we go. There we go. That could. Must stop again for a moment. Well, it's just a bark,
Yeah, you can't even hear it in the background.
If you hear any dogs barking, then that's just the way things happen.
It adds the ambiance.
All right, it's the ambiance. So, yeah, a lot of it just had to do with internal spying. That was supposedly just people voluntarily giving internal spying that would really involve people just voluntarily giving information. Yeah. But it was a system of internal spying. And there were agents in offices who handled this. Now, that's one thing. That's basically what we know. The whole idea that there being some sort of special disruption apparatus that would go in and... I mean, this would presumably explain Crisman's animosity towards the city government regime or the city manager regime in Tacoma. That there was something about people involved with it that the agency didn't like, and they wanted it disrupted. Mm. They wanted that opposed, and therefore becomes this kind of public figure to do that. So is that just Crisman grandstanding? Is that just him, again, turning himself into a much more important person than he actually was? Or was he receiving some kind of encouragement to do that? I don't know. I think most of it was his creative, self-aggrandizing imagination.
Yeah.
But to dismiss everything may be going a little bit too far in the other direction. I mean, there just may have been something to it. And it's the things that give me pause are what appears to be his kind of get out of jail free card. Nothing much ever really tends to stick to him. But we're still left with that question. It's the one I sort of posed at the beginning. Is Fred Crisman just a bullshit artist for all time, or is he a bullshit artist which does have some sort of secret life? Maybe not as elaborate as the one that he claims, but that it's not all bullshit. And I think that's something that we're probably never really going to get to the bottom of, but certainly is a realm of further exploration and speculation. So what eventually happens to Fred Crisman? Well, his role as a rabble-rousing radio talk show host pretty much ends by 1970. He's still going, on the other hand, to hippie love festivals in that part. He eventually he never quite leaves public office. He is appointed to the I think it's the Pierce County Library Board or the Tacoma Library Board, and he serves in that as a chairman, causing further trouble and disruption.
Okay.
He gets married for a third time in the spring of 1975, and then in December of that year dies in Seattle Hospital for reasons that are, he had health problems for some time. I think some of that is probably connected to alcoholism, which is never directly stated, but I think implied. There's also some sort of issue at one point he was trying to illegally obtain perhaps narcotics through a prescription. Mm-hmm. So there may have been some, I mean, he might have been popping painkillers and drinking for some time. He doesn't look well in the last years of his life. He appears to be significantly older than he actually is. And I think ostensibly it's through, and he had one bout of serious kidney failure about a year before, and then basically dies, or he was killed.
Okay.
So, which, why would that be if there was being too much attention paid to him, or if he had outlived his uses? But I think he just died.
Yeah.
I think he was a man with unhealthy habits and probably a number of injuries, and that's what did him in. But, you still have to wonder just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Rick. That was a good one.
Well, there we have it. There is the saga of Fred Lee Crisman. As close as you can get to it, the real story of Fred Lee Crisman. Oh, there's one more thing I have to add. It has to do with the Kennedy. So somehow this doesn't show up in anything else, but you will also, if you look at it, find out that three mysterious figures in the JFK assassination are the so-called tramps, the three tramps.
Woody Harrelson's dad.
Woody Harrelson, all kinds of people are supposed to be. Frank Sturgis is supposed to be one. E. Howard Hunt is supposed to be one.
Yeah.
So there were three guys who were rounded up at the Dallas rail yard the day of the assassination. They were questioned and they were released. They have been identified, supposedly, if you believe that. We now know who they were. None of them were Fred Crisman. But you will get these arguments. You will still see that especially the older tramp number 3, that is Fred Crisman. They're an exact lookalike. They're not. Okay? It doesn't fit, but it gives you an idea as to what people can convince themselves they can see and how the myth of Fred Crisman just continued to expand. So he gets connected to the JFK assassination, and then somehow he becomes one of the three tramps.
It's, so I think we talked about this the other day when the second or third or, somebody tried to shoot Trump when he was running. And it's now December. So what was this? October, maybe, when we talked about it. And they all, people, internet sleuths doing research on this guy, strange things, had companies that did nothing, whatever. I have a company that does nothing. They did this, they did that. Where are they always getting this money? How does it get out of jail? But you're repeatedly with this stuff, be it, I don't know, Manson or there's other figures we've talked about or are going to talk about that all seem to follow that same kind of MO, where they're thrill-seeking. Barry Seals comes to mind, right? The pilot who was helping, right? And they all have that. Are they bullshitting, or are they doing something? And it seems to be both. They're doing something. How significant?
Let's always keep in mind, if you have two choices, it's not necessarily one or the other.
Yeah.
It can be both. And, the one thing about most of them, and certainly overwhelmingly about Crisman, is that he's a bullshitter. There's no getting. That's much of what it is, but it may not be all of it. There could be, and I think there are to some degree, there are tantalizing clues to other things that are going on that are kind of hidden amidst this bullshit in these associations. If nothing else, even if it has nothing to do with CIA domestic spying operations or disruption, it has to do with some kind of criminal activity.
Yeah.
And I think the simplest idea is that Crisman and some of his associates by the late 60s are at least on the fringes of some kind of organized drug dealing.
Yeah.
Another thing, which is often a thing which to me explains a lot about his hostility towards the new regime in Tacoma, is that when this new regime comes in, it didn't grant things like cable TV licenses to his friend Reconasciuto.
Oh. Yeah.
Reconasciuto loses a lucrative cable TV contract. And that, I'm not sure you necessarily need anything more to explain the antagonism.
Yeah. Small time. Yeah.
There could be more, but there is certainly that.
Well,
corruption, criminality.
It seems like where there's smoke, there's fire, at least. And it's like you were saying, it doesn't necessarily have. The military record is what throws it into contention for me. It's like, wow, you're rubbing shoulders with people who could seemingly connect you with other people to seemingly do domestic operations or whatever.
Well, there's even a question about his military records. So, basically what you want to look for is what's now called a DD-214. It's a record of service.
Yeah.
And those don't necessarily contain everything. I've looked at a lot of those, and they're not always complete. But they're generally good for about what ranks people held, where they were, what units they were connected to. And in the case of Crisman's, his actual World War II service records and Korean service records were destroyed in a fire in the St. Louis Personnel Record Center, I think, which is in the 70s. And destroyed. It isn't just his.
Yeah.
If it was just his that burned, that would be suspicious. But there were thousands and thousands of records that were destroyed. So what we have is a reconstruction of those records. And there are actually two different reconstructions. So there was a reconstruction that was done, I think, by the St. Louis Records Office, trying to reassemble it from references elsewhere. And then there was a separate reconstruction that was done by the House Committee on Assassinations in 1977, where, of course, Crisman was dead by this time, but his name inevitably comes up. Now, those two reconstructions of his service record are basically the same, but they're not identical.
Okay.
They don't. There's this slight difference between what medals were received. One mentions one thing that another one doesn't, and vice versa. Which means that we don't have the original. What we have are two different partial reconstructions that do not completely agree. That's kind of what you find everything about Crisman in some way. So there's room there. It's impossible to say, therefore, that everything is ruled in or ruled out through those, because you don't have the whole picture. You've got a part of it.
A man of mystery.
A man of mystery indeed. And that is where we'll leave it.